Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer,
And I'm Krista Carmen.
and this is
Murder Coaster.
What is Evil? Some folks see it as a supernatural force from the devil, whose demonic army rises from the pits of hell to influence and possess, and that only religion and the church can stop this demonic force. But in reality, sometimes it's the ones that profess to love God who are the evil ones, and those that hail Satan who are the innocent and good. Today we bring you a story of a professor and scholar, a doctor of neuroscience who stole enough CIA-donated LSD to get an entire town high and went to the forest to practice Satanism. But it wasn't the devil that came to slay him and his lover. It was something much more benign and commonplace. Step aboard the murder coaster, ladies and gentlemen, for a dark ride into the Corpsewood Manor Massacre.
Let's begin. Prologue. The Trouble at Corpsewood Manor. It was a cold day in the mountains of northwest Georgia on December 15th, 1982, as Raymond Williams drove through the deeply wooded backroads of Chattooga County, headed to Corpsewood Manor with a heavy heart. He was going to see Dr. Charles Scudder and his partner, Joseph Odom, or Joey as everyone called him, to tell them some bad news. A mutual friend of theirs had passed away.
The tires crunched over the frozen earth as Raymond steered his pickup truck up the mountain. He had been to Dr. Scudder's bizarre house a few days earlier, recording the doctor as he strummed his golden harp and recited William Blake's poem, The Tiger.
Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?
Dr. Scudder was an accomplished musician and had once even been invited to play harp with the Chicago Orchestra. His golden harp was one of his prized possessions.
Raymond steered his truck onto the muddy ruts of Dead Horse Road, named by Dr. Scudder because when he and Joey had first come to the land, seeking out a homestead, they encountered a dead and rotting horse corpse lying along the road. And then Raymond was coming upon the little compound they called Corpsewood, also named by the good doctor, as the area sat in a grove of ominous oaks, the deciduous trees without leaves and dead-looking in the winter months. The doctor obviously had Gothic sensibilities and a dark sense of humor, and a sign along the road read, "Beware of the Thing."
Some superstitious locals claimed the Thing was a demon the doctor had conjured up to protect the land.
Dr. Scudder was quite the character. He'd been an esteemed professor of pharmacology at Loyola College and assistant director of the Institute for the Study of Mind, Drugs, and Behavior. Married twice with grown children, but when he turned 50, he suddenly decided to give it all up, drop out of society, move to the middle of the woods, and live off the land.
Not many people knew this about him, but when he left the school, he'd brought along 2 human skulls and 4 large vials containing over 22,000 hits of liquid LSD 25 the CIA had given the school for testing. No one at the university had even noticed they were missing.
Raymond swung his car down through the forest, the winter sun glittering through the branches. Past the crazy 3-story chicken house, the land curved and contoured, dug out in swalls with rock walls in circular patterns to move water without erosion and capture heat. All permaculture homesteading methods. A lush orchard and garden, and a small vineyard from which Dr. Scudder made his famous wines. But it was December now, the deciduous trees and grapevines bare of leaves and skeletal. Raymond finally pulled up to the imposing brick house.
People called it a castle, and it did look like a castle, and seemed quite large from the outside. But it was actually a rather small structure, only 16 feet wide, but 44 feet long, appearing larger because of its length and the grand connecting entranceway, a gazebo, fashioned like a castle top, complete with a pink gargoyle. There was even a large trap door from the second story that dropped down onto the entranceway top, and they would sit there on the castle turret and sip wine, studying the forest and the stars, the changing seasons as the years passed.
Dr. Scudder and Joey had built the castle themselves by hand, brick by brick. It had taken them nearly 2 years. Neither of them had ever done any masonry work before. The corners of the house were curved so that there were no right angles. Nothing was straight, everything curved, another permaculture principle, but also a metaphor for Dr. Scudder's life.
But it was off grid in the extreme. There was no electricity at all, no generator, no solar panels. Dr. Scudder and Joey had wanted to live completely in tune with nature, be intimately aware of the rising and falling of the sun, and they only used candles and kerosene lamps.
Raymond immediately felt things were odd when Dr. Scudder's two huge English mastiffs, Beelzebub and Arseniath, didn't come running out barking. There was often a beehive of energy on the little homestead, but now it was ominously quiet. Dr. Scudder only went to town once a month to get supplies. It wasn't like him to not be here, and even when he did go out, Joey and the dogs would stay. It was very unusual for the land to be completely unoccupied.
And there were often gatherings, even a huge wedding once, when Joan and Bruce Poole had tied the knot on the land. Sometimes families would be there, with kids racing about, like Candace Williamson and her children, coming to enjoy the pastoral setting. Candace and Dr. Scudder would drink wine and play chess as her children frolicked, trading books and talking about literature as Joey prepared a gourmet meal in the kitchen.
To have someone so intelligent and cultured there in the backwoods of Georgia, many people sought them out. It was a very wholesome scene in many ways, peaceful and introspective. Dr. Scudder and Joey were obviously a gay couple, and it was rural Georgia in the early 80s, but they'd been there 6 years and had earned themselves a reputation as good people. They didn't cause any trouble, kept to themselves. Their land was immaculately clean, a fully functioning homestead. Dr. Scudder even writing articles on organic farming for Mother Earth News. They'd become an established institution in a way. They had beehives and rose gardens with antique heirloom roses. Old ladies went gaga over. They ground their own wheat for bread and knew where in the forest to forage for the best berries.
Corpsewood Manor became a social destination for folks. Joey was an exceptional chef who loved to cook and would prepare gourmet meals, while Dr. Scudder served as the charming host, often playing his golden harp for guests. Candace Grogan, a Treon local, told of a candlelit dinner party at Corpsewood Manor that featured a 5-course meal, complete with wine served in silver goblets, and would later tell the Chicago Tribune, quote, "It was a fantasy," end quote.
There were other eccentric characters about, too. One of their neighbors, Zeke, a paunchy older gentleman with a long gray handlebar mustache, was a practicing nudist and could be seen lying on the hills in the summertime, absorbing the solar light energy through his epidermis.
Raymond noticed Dr. Scudder's Jeep was not in the driveway. Everything felt off as he stepped out of his vehicle and approached the house. It was so quiet. No dogs barking, not even birds singing in the trees. Something was definitely not right. He glanced up at the ominous brick house, the gargoyle-topped castle turret. From the chimneys loomed black, inverted pentagrams. And I'm just going to throw in a quick note here. There seems to be some confusion about 5-pointed stars. After our Richard Ramirez episode, a listener wrote in that an inverted pentagram was called a pentacle. Now, we love getting feedback. We really, really appreciate listeners taking the time to contact us. But an inverted pentagram is not called a pentacle. As anyone who's ever used tarot cards would know, a pentacle is a pentagram within a circle. An inverted pentagram is just that, a five-pointed star with the point facing downwards, which usually implies as above, so below. But we could do an entire podcast series on pentagrams and all their different meanings. I'm just going to leave it at that for now.
Dr. Scudder didn't talk about religion much. When it was brought up, he'd tell people he was an atheist, which he was. But he was also a card-carrying member of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. The small brick castle was littered with satanic images, including a huge stained glass window that Dr. Scudder had painstakingly made himself, of the sigil of Baphomet, the symbol of the Church of Satan, an inverted pentacle with a goat's head within it, with Hebrew letters at each point of the star, spelling out Leviathan.
Dr. Scudder didn't hide his ties with Satanism. He proudly displayed a large inverted pentagram on the door of his black Jeep. Anton LaVey's book, The Satanic Bible, had helped him understand himself and throw off the shackles of religion and society, freed him both mentally and physically, led him to where he was. But it wasn't something he preached, and he certainly didn't worship devils, didn't believe in a literal devil. He was an atheist. Satanism was just a philosophy of atheism that offered him enlightenment and allowed him to live his life freely.
Raymond Williams looked about the deserted grounds, a bitter wind whipping through the forest as he called out, "Hello? Anybody home?" Even if Dr. Scudder had left, Joey and the dogs should be here somewhere. He circled the house and saw the black metal storm door was open, swinging in the breeze. Peering inside, he saw the kitchen door was rattled with bullet holes, the glass smashed out and lying shattered on the ground with a smattering of bullet casings. In a panic, Raymond sped to a payphone and called the police.
Police entered the house through the back ajar door and immediately noticed large puddles of blood everywhere, swarms of flies, and an overbearing reek of death. They found Dr. Charles Scudder in a prone position, hands bound, leaning against his bookshelf, a gag in his mouth, and 5 bullet wounds to his head, eyes glazed and open. By the wood stove lay his prized English mastiffs, Beelzebub and Arseniath, also shot to death. And in the doorway to the main entrance lay Joey, shirtless, wearing jeans and hiking boots, also dead from multiple gunshot wounds to the head.
The first thing the police noticed was all the satanic art. There was a lot of it, including a black and gold Mephistopheles statue. Hidden behind paintings of a baby being born on one side, emerging from the womb, and a baby dead and skeletonized on the other, was a hidden altar containing silver vessels and a worn copy of Anton LaVey's The Satanic Bible. And oddly enough, there was a painting of the doctor himself on the wall, a self-portrait showing him gagged and shot.
What if the police thought that was weird? When the detectives got to the chicken house, they were in for something else.
The chicken house was a rectangular 3-story structure. The bottom floor was, as the name implies, a chicken coop. To reach the second floor, you had to climb a ladder up through a hatch and into a storage area, where they kept their wine press, livestock feed, all the preserves of fruit and vegetables, pickles, jellies, jams, as well as many wines and meads they made, making wine out of everything from watermelon to carrots, not to mention the doctor's vineyard of Sauvignon Blanc and Merlot grapes. Also in this storage area was an extensive library of gay pornography.
And on the third and top floor was a large windowless room painted entirely pink, with pink carpeting and mattresses adorned with pink sheets and pink pillows strewn throughout. A room they called the guest room, but that others called the pleasure room. It was a room where all pleasures were allowed to be explored and fantasies lived out. There were bondage straps attached to the walls, handcuffs and whips lying about. There was also allegedly a guest book signed by all the men who had come there and experienced pleasure. Their names, where they lived, what sex positions and role playing games they liked, and even included photographs. And there were men in the guest book from all over the world traveling to visit the doctor, to be wined and dined and gourmet, locally sourced farm fresh food and homemade wine from only the most exquisite grapes before joining Charles and Joey in the pink room for an orgy. It said there were local names on the list as well, prominent local names. And mysteriously, this sex ledger would go missing during the ensuing investigation, and some would claim it didn't even exist at all.
Several law enforcement officers confirmed seeing the book and the names, and Sheriff Gary McConnell insists that it was turned in as evidence, but it just disappeared. Also missing is every photograph of the pink room itself. Though this room would play prominently in the investigation and ensuing court cases, there is no known existing photograph of the room.
And then they found the acid. 3 vials of Sandoz LSD 25 in the doctor's drawer, still bearing the labels from the federal government. One was nearly empty, the other opened with some removed, the last still sealed tight. The investigation just got thrown for another loop.
Pressed about their investigation by reporters, the sheriff released a statement to the press saying,
"It was pretty well known they were devil worshippers, and we looked into prosecuting them for that. But there was nothing we could do. I guess that's just freedom of religion." And what the fuck? They actually tried to prosecute them for being members of the Church of Satan. Like, welcome to Georgia.
Jesus. So these murders had it all: sex, drugs, Satanism. You think there would be countless leads, a long line of suspects. But there was only one problem. They couldn't find anyone who didn't like these guys. No enemies. Everyone who met them were charmed. They were generous, they were kind, they were giving and intelligent. Who could want them dead?
Before we can answer that, we need to take a look at just who Dr. Scudder was.
Chapter 1. Little Buddy Lee. Charles Lee Scudder, or Buddy Lee as he was known as a child, was born on October 6, 1926, in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, to Captain Charles Morrison Scudder, a World War I veteran and mechanical engineer, and his wife, Eleanor Lee Scudder. Both of Buddy Lee's parents were college educated, which was rare at the time, and the family was wealthy and prosperous.
Buddy Lee was an intelligent and well-behaved child. He did well in school, was an honor student, and went to the University of Wisconsin, where he studied zoology. When his father died, Charles, only 19, married 21-year-old fellow college student Helen Hazlett, but they were very young and argued about what they wanted to do with their lives. She transferred to Stanford in California, and the marriage fell apart. Soon they were divorced.
Charles got his master's degree in 1949 and then married Borte Bunting, the daughter of internationally acclaimed British poet Basil Bunting. She was an activist for social justice causes and had been arrested for civil disobedience. They were pretty much like beatniks, and they settled down in a farm in Wisconsin in 1950 and quickly had 4 children: Saul, Fenris, Sorrow, Gideon, and Ahab.
But the marriage wasn't working, and Charles moved to Chicago, where he tried his hand at being a painter and even had a piece in the Chicago Artists Exhibition. He started teaching biology at the University of Illinois while he went to graduate school at the Stritch Medical School, where he received his PhD in pharmacology in 1964.
He became an associate professor of pharmacology at the medical school's Department of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics, along with being the assistant director of Stritch's Institute for the Study of Mind, Drugs, and Behavior, where he did government-funded experiments with psychoactive drugs, including LSD.
He loved antiques and bought an old mansion on Chicago's West Side, a place big enough to raise his 4 children and store his collection of antique furniture and odd artifacts that he'd collected over the years. The mansion was on Adams Street, a name he liked, as he was a huge fan of the cartoon The Addams Family in the New Yorker magazine.
Then Charles met Joseph Odom, or Joey, who was working in a bookstore Charles frequented. Joey, who was 12 years younger than Charles, had been born into crushing poverty and had dropped out of school in the 5th grade. He'd been in and out of jail a few times, but had learned the essentials of cooking and carpentry along the way. He was a great chef and good with a hammer, so Charles hired him as a housekeeper and cook.
Charles was quite the nutty professor, known as a brilliant but eccentric character at the school. He'd dye his hair purple, and he had a pet monkey. His mansion was filled with bizarre artifacts. And at some point, he started reading the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey, and it awakened something in him, offered a different way of looking at the world, showed that he didn't need to live in a straight society, be a part of the rat race and the moralistic structure of conformist American values. It really resonated with him. Everything Anton LaVey said about religion being a means of controlling people and their true natures.
And part of Charles' true nature, that he'd been keeping a secret his whole life, was that he was gay. He opened himself up to Joey, who was also gay, and the two became lovers. But Charles didn't tell anyone at work, or any of his friends or acquaintances or family. As far as anyone knew, Joey just worked for Charles as his handyman, chef, and secretary in the big mansion.
Charles quietly dedicated more of his life to studying the works of Anton LaVey, officially joining the Church of Satan. He and Joey got 2 English Mastiff puppies and named them Beelzebub after the infamous demon, and Arseniath from the H.P. Lovecraft story, The Thing on the Doorstep.
But Charles would then suffer a series of terrible personal blows that would cause him to question the meaning of existence and what he was doing with his life. First, his mother died, and then his son, Ahab, died in a tragic accident in New York City. Looking inward, he realized he was tired of the city, tired of academics. He was done. Done with Chicago, done with teaching, done with his professorship, his studies, everything. His children were grown and on their own. His ex-wife was in Washington State working as an assistant attorney general. Charles just wanted to go to the middle of the woods and live off the land. No electricity, no running water, just start from scratch. Somewhere that it wasn't freezing, like Chicago, someplace warm. And somehow he chose Chattooga, Georgia, as the place to escape to and establish a homestead.
On his 50th birthday, he resigned from his professorship, eager to start a new life, a whole new chapter. He was 50, but he looked and felt like a man in his 30s, slender, healthy, very handsome, with a thin face and prominent cheekbones. With his bleached blonde hair, he looked a bit like David Bowie.
He received a small inheritance from his mother, and he went for it, decided to leave polite society behind. He sold his mansion, bought a Jeep and a camper, auctioned off his antiques, and after appropriating several human skulls and enough LSD to get a small town high, he took off to Georgia with his lover Joey, leaving Chicago right in the midst of a blizzard to start a new life.
Chapter 2, Georgia on my mind. So why Chattooga County, Georgia? And why this sleepy little town of Treon, nestled between Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Rome, Georgia? Well, it was warm, which was important, and cheap, which I think was crucial. He really got a deal and wasn't concerned that an entire family had died of rattlesnake bites on the land. Georgia is directly below Chicago. It's a straight shot. But maybe, just maybe, there was something more. Maybe it was something supernatural. Ooh.
It turns out the sleepy little town of Treon, Georgia, was a very strange place. At the same time as Charles and Joey were starting their homestead, a local bicycle repairman and street preacher there in Treon, Georgia, named Howard Finster, was suddenly overcome with a great calling, a voice commanding him to, quote, paint sacred art, paint sacred art, paint sacred art, end quote.
When Howard said, "But I ain't a professional artist," the voice whispered back to him,
How do you know?
So he started painting. First George Washington, which he simply copied off a dollar bill. And then Elvis. He started painting Elvis everywhere, all over his old Cadillac. And he painted angels drinking soda pop and weird words of scripture painted around them.
Folks noticed his work, and people started commissioning him, buying his paintings and donating strange objects, like a sarcophagus with a glass window you could look into and see the ancient mummified remains of a teenage girl. Then, the same year as the Corpsewood murders, he managed to buy an abandoned church, which he rebuilt into a 4-story wonder with circular staircases, off a plan he received in a vision from God.
Time magazine wrote about him. The Talking Heads and REM had him do the artwork for their albums, and he ended up making over 46,000 works of art.
And the tiny area with a population of only 1,700 had its share of horrible and ghastly events as well.
13-year-old Lisa Ann Milliken was kidnapped from the local shopping mall by husband and wife Judith and Alvin Treenborn, who would sexually assault and torture her for days, injecting Drano into the girl before shooting her and pushing her off a cliff. Then they went on to sexually assault and murder another girl, Janice Chapman. When it was discovered that Judith was the instigator of the crimes, she was sentenced to death and was the youngest woman ever put on death row. And it's so strange. While in prison, she started corresponding with another woman whom she somehow convinced to kill herself in some crazy kind of bizarre suicide pact that Judith did not follow through with on her end. It's very, very creepy.
That is creepy, jeez. And later, 400-pound schizophrenic Hayward Bissell, who'd never shown signs of violence before, would butcher his girlfriend right in the parking lot of a Treon convenience store, cutting off her left hand and leg, pushing her eyes so far into their sockets that they were originally believed to be cut out. Oh, that freaks me out. When he was questioned by police, he casually pulled her esophagus out of his pocket and started chewing on it.
And there's even more, but we're going to get to that later. It's just utterly insane and bizarre links to the Corpsewood murders. So, just a weird place. Coincidences? Or was some kind of energy, some psychic magnet, pulling all these forces together into a maelstrom there in rural Georgia in the late 70s and early 80s?
Chapter 3: The Land. Charles and Joey left Chicago in a blizzard, driving through the ice and snow of Illinois, down through Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee, only to arrive in Georgia late at night and getting completely lost on the rural dirt roads and had to sleep in their Jeep. But they took it all in stride, finding their way in the morning only to be greeted by the corpse of a rotting dead horse and a grove of dead oak trees, their branches withered and skeletal.
They set up a tent and started the laborious task of creating a homestead out of raw, pristine forest.
They cleared the land, then set to building their own house by hand, laying out a foundation of bricks in a slightly curved, cornerless pattern, like an amoeba, using nothing more than a concrete mixer and a spade, brick by brick, putting in native grasses to create lush meadows, an orchard of fruit trees, a vineyard, planting heirloom roses for beauty and their lush summer scent, as well as to attract pollinating insects, incorporating patches of curving, cornerless gardens throughout.
And you read a lot about the shapes of the gardens in the house, everyone tying it back to their spiritual beliefs in occultism and magic. But that's some basic permaculture principles, though the word permaculture itself wasn't invented until 1978. But nature abhors right angles and straight lines, and for a reason. It's much more effective in a garden, say, to mimic the contours of a leaf, or to plant in a round keyhole pattern to get more space and sunlight input out of an area. He was really ahead of his time and knew what he was doing, digging swales and berms, all hand lined with rock that moved the rainwater through the homestead so there would be no erosion, and gave them flat spaces to build structures, have parking, and put in gardens.
Brick by brick, they got the first floor of the castle built, and put a roof over it so they had a place to live while they built the second floor. A year later, they had the second floor finished and were able to occupy their new house. Soon the gazebo entrance was constructed and festooned with the pink gargoyle.
The Corpsewood Manor homestead was up and running.
All the trees they'd taken down for the gardens and orchards and living spaces were converted into firewood. They buried a refrigerator in the shade on a north-facing slope, and it maintained a very cool temperature for them to store perishables. The plums were already producing, and the grapes soon followed, and Charles started making his own wines, which would become famous among the locals.
They found a local farmer who would sell them 100 pounds of wheat for $7, and they'd grind it themselves into flour, working during the daylight hours, reading and playing music by kerosene light and candles at night.
Charles tried to get a job teaching at the local high school, but they said he was overqualified, a professor of neuroscience applying to teach at a backwoods Georgia high school. They were probably just suspicious and scared of him.
Charles was obsessed with tarot cards and began writing a scientific interpretation of the major arcana. He was transfixed on what the first card of the major arcana, the Fool card, meant, and he'd often give people tarot card readings.
One evening, they were entertaining, and Claude Bullard, the owner of the small grocery store at the foot of the mountains, was there drinking wine, and Charles offered to read him his tarot cards. Charles was usually jovial and making jokes, having fun, but that night, dealing out the cards in the candlelight, he became suddenly very somber, saying,
Claude, I am seeing something very serious and disturbing here.
"Serious how?
A transition.
What, am I going to die?"
I'm afraid it appears that way.
Claude just laughed, exclaiming, quote, "Dang, y'all told me that getting my cards read was gonna be fun. I reckon the fun begins when I drop dead." End quote.
3 weeks later, Claude Boulard would fall over dead from a heart attack. Dr. Charles Scudder abandoned his book on tarot cards and never gave a reading again.
Charles and Joey not only indulge in their love of nature, living off the land, becoming one with the changing seasons, growing crops and working the earth, they also indulge in their sexual fantasies. They create the Pink Room, a place of sexual escapades and role-playing, coming to be known as the Pleasure Chamber.
Charles placed classified ads in the Gay Community News, a weekly newspaper printed in Boston and sent nationwide. Charles put invitations out far and wide for curious men to come and explore their desires. He corresponded with other teachers, models, and with a lot of former prisoners, like Joey, as well as men in prison. It's said before they'd hold an orgy, he'd ask some of the men to come to the land early so he could physically examine them, looking for signs of sickness or disease, so he could ensure his guests that everyone was healthy.
Detectives would later find some of the medical examinations of men written in the doctor's diary.
But the two kept up the appearance of respectable, educated, refined, back to the land pagans, which they were, and were well liked by all who met them. Occasionally, hikers, the lost, or hunters would come wandering up. Charles and Joey were always kind and gracious.
One day, a 17-year-old hunter named Kenneth Avery Brock stumbled upon the satanic brick castle, like something out of a fairy tale. Kenneth knew the mountains and backwoods, as he'd worked hauling logs in the national forest. And he'd heard rumors about the gay Satan worshippers in the middle of the woods. But here he was. It was real.
Charles and Joey greeted Kenneth kindly, told him he was welcome to hunt on their land, and asked if he'd like a glass of Charles's famous wine. Little did they know, they were inviting death onto their land.
Chapter 4: The Killers.
This is how Kenneth Avery Brock's mother, Betty Lou, describes him.
"He was a real good boy. He was raised in church. He always did what I asked him to do, and he was never sassy. He was just a real good boy. That's the only way I can describe him."
Indeed, Kenneth had been to a Bible study on the value of the love of Christ just shortly before going out to murder the kind and peaceful gay Satanists Charles and Joey in cold blood.
Here's how Kenneth Avery Brock described himself.
Never been to a professional sporting event, nor a live concert, never eaten in a restaurant, never had a job where I drew a paycheck where they drew out taxes, never been married. I don't know what it's like to be loved by a woman.
The 17-year-old Kenneth lived in a derelict trailer in the woods with a 30-year-old psychopath named Tony West, who at 13 had shot his 2-year-old cousin in the head, killing him. Tony had been in and out of mental institutions and jail his entire life. At one point, he'd escaped from jail, where he was serving time for theft, and shot his brother-in-law, seriously wounding him.
Bad news, Tony.
Right, and Kenneth took Bad News Tony to Corpsewood to meet Charles and Joey. But Tony didn't like them because they were gay. He says he was brought up better than that. Bad News Tony is a Christian after all.
So Kenneth claims that at some point during his visits to Corpsewood, Charles gave him a blowjob in the pink room, but it's disputed whether it happened or not. But he claims he willingly let Charles commit fellatio on him, which I don't know if I believe it or not. I mean, I guess I could see it. But the question is, so what? Now, legally speaking, it's really complicated because check this out. At the time in that county in Georgia, the age of consent was only 16. So they were both considered consensual adults in the eyes of the law. But not only was homosexuality illegal, oral sex was illegal as well, regardless of who was doing it. So if it is true, it's a weird prism to judge by. But in my opinion, I don't care what Georgia law said. A 17-year-old is a child and they can't give consent. But anyway, that's that.
But some say this incident was made up as an excuse for the murders, enabling them to say that it was a revenge killing because Charles had taken advantage of Kenneth. But either way, Tony and Kenneth decided they were going to rob and murder Charles and Joey.
These guys are such morons. They love to huff this concoction of lacquer, paint, and wood alcohol that they called Toodaloo, dosing it on rags and putting it in a bag to huff. And I guess they called it Toodaloo because it makes you go bye-bye.
Oh, Jesus. So they get it in their heads that Charles is rich, which he wasn't. He'd spent all his inheritance on the homestead and was living on a fixed income off some investments. And neither Tony nor Kenneth had ever been allowed into the actual castle itself. They didn't know what was in there.
Yeah, though Charles was really friendly with visitors, he didn't just let anyone into his home or his life. Kenneth and Tony were so low on the totem pole at Corpsewood, they weren't even allowed in the castle, just allowed to party in the pink room.
But after Kenneth and Tony went to their Bible study, they made plans to rob Corpsewood Manor, thinking the castle must be loaded with cash and valuables.
Kenneth begins to disturbingly fantasize about torturing Charles into telling him where all his hidden jewels and cash are, saying he would rape him with a hot soldering iron to get him to talk. Some fucked up shit right there.
Kenneth borrows a .22 rifle from his mother, Betty Lou, which was perfectly normal for he often used it to go hunting.
They go over to Tony's sister's trailer to watch some football, where they hook up with Tony's cousin, Joey Wells, and a girl named Teresa Hudgens. And then they all pile into Tony's 10-year-old Javelin car and headed to Corpsewood Manor to rob the place.
All of which begs the question, why on earth would they bring these two teenagers along with them? Did they even know what was about to happen? Kenneth claims that Tony's cousin was in on it, even orchestrated it, but he denies it, and they all seem to agree that Teresa Hudgens had absolutely no idea what was about to unfold.
It's the evening of December 12th, 1982, and the three teenagers and one 30-year-old are huffing their Toodaloo as they pull up to the homestead. Charles meets them outside and invites them up into the pleasure palace. They climb the ladder up the side of the chicken coop past the storage room and into the pink room. Charles lit a lantern, and they all sat back on the pink mattresses and pillows, drinking wine and smoking cigarettes. At some point, Kenneth excused himself from the group, saying he was going to get the Toodaloo from the car, and returned with a rifle.
When Charles saw the rifle, he just smiled and laughed and said, quote, "Bang, bang," end quote.
Kenneth, utterly disarmed by the charming professor, laughed too and laid the gun down, and they continued drinking and chatting for a while. But when Charles got up to adjust the wick on the lantern, Kenneth leapt at him, grabbing him by the hair, pulling his head back, and put a knife to his throat.
Charles, still calm and cool, whispered.
"What kind of game do you want to play? I'll play your game."
Kenneth then threw him down and began to rip the sheets to shreds, using the torn pieces to tie his arms behind his back.
And at this point, it's pandemonium. Teresa, who had absolutely no idea what the hell was happening, where she was, who these people even were, is crying, screaming.
"Don't hurt him! Let's go!"
Again, why they took this girl along on a robbery is beyond me. They are just so incredibly dumb. I think Kenneth is doing all this to impress his 30-year-old friend, Bad News Tony. But Kenneth takes the gun and heads to the satanic castle on his own. Tony's cousin supposedly tells him, "You don't need this on you, man. Let's get out of here." And Tony answers back,
"It's a way of life."
and I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Robbing and murdering completely innocent people who invited you to their land and gave you free wine is a way of life.
Kenneth, rifle in hand, goes to the castle where Joey is cleaning up after dinner, absolutely unaware of the chaos going on in the chicken house. Kenneth goes to the back door and yells for Joey to come outside. As Joey approaches the door, Kenneth erupts with a barrage of gunfire, killing Joey and the dogs.
Exactly how it went down, what was said, whether he killed the dogs first or second is not known. And it's really odd because the dogs were found curled up around the wood stove as if they were sleeping.
Kenneth then goes back to the pink room. They drag Charles, bound and gagged, down the ladder, through the night into the back door of the castle, shoving him into the kitchen. Charles gazes down the hall and sees his prized dogs dead beside the wood stove, then sees Joey, his life partner and lover of 23 years, lying in a pool of blood, 4 gunshots to the head, 1 in the arm, and he throws himself, weeping and hysterical, to the floor beside Joey, screaming through the gag.
Kenneth and Tony grab Charles, throw him onto the sofa, and pull his gag down, barking questions at him as he moans and weeps. Now Tony has the gun, holding it pointed at Charles as Kenneth interrogates him.
"Where's all the money?"
Why? Why did you do this?
I said, "Where's the money?"
What money? I don't have any money.
"Bullshit. You gotta have money. What do you buy groceries with?"
Whatever cash we have is in the bank. I write checks for everything.
"Bullshit. You got a soldering iron?"
A what?
"A soldering iron."
Soldering iron? No, you idiot. There's no electricity. Why would I have a fucking soldering iron? Oh, why? Why?
At this point, Charles pushes himself up and goes back to his lover's body, weeping, and says,
I asked for this. I asked for this.
What he meant by this is often debated. Some believe he meant it was the price of sin, that he'd asked for it by becoming a Satanist and being openly gay, that he was remorseful, that he was even asking forgiveness. Others think he's simply telling himself how stupid he was, that he asked for trouble by letting these people into his life, people he had nothing in common with whatsoever. But what Dr. Charles Scudder meant that terrible night in December of 1982, we will never know.
Tony screamed at Charles to sit back down on the sofa. And when Charles turned towards him with an ungodly look of anger, rage, remorse, and pain on his face, Tony shot him 4 times in the head, sending him sprawling backwards into his bookcase.
Kenneth and Wells then went upstairs to rummage for valuables, leaving Tony and Teresa alone downstairs with the bodies. 30-year-old Tony telling his cousin he needed to talk to the teenage girl. With the rifle in his hands, no-good Tony then began to aggressively flirt with Teresa, who, by the way, was on a date with his cousin at the time. Nice date. It got so tense she thought he might actually rape her, but Kenneth and Wells soon returned with the loot. A few rare coins, some jewelry, a gold-plated dagger, a silver candelabra, which, what is this, Victorian times? You're stealing the silver candle holders? And a pistol. Somehow not noticing the 22,000 hits of LSD in the desk with a street value of around 100 grand.
When Kenneth got back, Charles began to moan. So Kenneth went and shot him between the eyes point blank with his pistol, hollering,
"Now, by God, tell me I don't have the guts to kill somebody."
Nearly hanging on the wall was a self-portrait Charles had painted with a gag in his mouth and 5 bullet holes in his head. Joey had seen this image in a vision during a dream and told Charles about it, who'd immediately painted the forlorn image. Ooh-ee-ooh.
They decided to steal the Jeep as well, and then gathered more loot to pack, trying to jam Charles' prized golden harp into the back, but it was too large to fit.
Going back to the house one last time, to their amazement, they found Joey alive and dragging himself across the floor, leaving large puddles of blood behind him. Kenneth then took the pistol and shot him in the head as well.
The four then drove back to the trailer park, where 30-year-old no-good Tony told the teenagers that if anyone talked, they were dead, and said he and Kenneth were headed to the Philippines, which I wonder if you realized you can't drive there.
But Teresa is talking within literal minutes, immediately telling Tony's aunt what had happened. And soon the whole trailer park knew the story. But it would take over 4 days before someone would finally call the cops and report it.
Tony sold his car, which was running like shit, for $7, with the promise of 60 more bucks later. And he and Kenneth hop in the stolen Jeep with the huge inverted pentagram painted on the door, telling everyone they were headed to Florida. But that was just to throw off the scent. In reality, they were headed west through Alabama and Mississippi to Mexico.
Chapter 5: Idiots on the Run. On the evening of December 13th, 1981, Kenneth and Tony pulled the stolen Jeep into a rest stop east of Vicksburg, Mississippi, and crashed for the night. When they woke up in the morning, there was a car parked beside them, a Toyota, with a man sleeping in it. The two idiots decided they would ditch the Jeep and steal this man's car.
They took the man out of his car at gunpoint. He was a lieutenant in the Navy named Kirby Key Phelps. They marched him to a tree, where they attempted to handcuff him, and when he struggled, they shot him in the head.
He wasn't a Satanist. He wasn't a hippie. He wasn't gay. He was just a hard-working lieutenant in the military, sleeping in his car at a rest stop. And these idiots are cold-blooded killers.
As Teresa Hudgens was telling the sheriff everything about, quote, them devil worshiper killings, end quote, Kenneth and Tony fled through Louisiana and into Texas on their way toward the Mexican border.
Meanwhile, when word of the murder spread to the community, pandemonium broke out at Corpsewood Manor. Huge crowds of people rushed out into the woods to get a look at the place and grab a souvenir. The steel doors to the house had been welded shut by the cops to keep people out, but they were ripped off their hinges and actually still lie there to this day. Close friends came and tried to stop the looting. Fist fights broke out, and in the end, even the prize rose bushes were dug up. The place was literally ripped apart.
In Texas, the money is just about all gone, and Kenneth and Tony are arguing about everything. Should they go to Mexico? How would they survive? Maybe they should stay in America and keep killing. They decide to go to a strip club and have a beer to relax. But Kenneth won't stop. He's acting crazy, impulsive, and the older and more mature Tony finally tells him to get lost. So Kenneth starts hitchhiking back to Georgia. Oddly enough, one of the first rides he gets is from an off-duty police officer who has no idea he's a murderer on the run.
It was about 8 days after the Corpsewood Manor Massacre when Kenneth called his mama, Betty Jo, from a payphone at a gas station in Marietta, Georgia, asking her to pick him up. She told him there was a warrant out for his arrest and the police were looking for him. He told her it was Tony who had done all the killings and he was completely innocent. And as luck would have it, who should be pulling up to Betty Jo's door but the sheriff, coming to interview her just as she's getting off the phone. And she soon breaks, tells the sheriff where her son is, waiting for her, and officers are sent to pick him up at the gas station, where he'd gone and told the attendants that he was a desperado wanted for murder.
Tony, meanwhile, decided to head back to Georgia after all, but runs out of gas on Christmas Eve in the rain on the Tennessee border. Walking, soaked to the bone, penniless and despondent through the rain, he runs into a Chattanooga police officer. He turns himself in, says he's guilty of the murders, and the guy has no idea what he's talking about. This Tennessee police officer somehow hasn't even heard about the murders, despite it being broadcast on news channels around the world, the murder of these gay Satanists. The cop runs his name through the system. Nothing. Runs it again. Nothing. The cop tells him he's got no warrants and is free to go, but Tony insists he's wanted for murder. So the cop drives him into Georgia and to the Treon police station, and they confirm that very much, yes, he does have warrants for not one, not two, but 3 murders.
Kenneth Brock ended up pleading guilty to avoid the death penalty.
But Tony West went to trial, where he faced George's electric chair, despite it having just caught a guy's head on fire very recently. His initial defense, when he'd been questioned by police, was that he was bewitched, saying,
"All I know is they were devils, and I killed them." But of course, this would not explain the murder of Lieutenant Phelps at the rest stop.
Then his lawyers discovered there was LSD in the house and focused on this. Started saying he'd been slipped LSD by the evil satanic doctor, who'd put it in the wine he gave them, and that Tony and Kenneth had gone into a drug-fueled psychosis. Though the wine was tested, the cups were tested, blood tests were made, and Teresa Hudgens testified she'd drank the same wine and she was fine, and said they weren't acting or behaving any differently.
And the jury saw through it all. They deliberated for only 2 hours before pronouncing him guilty on all counts.
He was sentenced to die in the electric chair on May 2nd, less than 2 months away.
When the judge said, "May God have mercy on your soul," no good Tony just calmly lit a cigarette. The old days when you could smoke in the courtroom.
But the sentence was overturned by the Georgia Supreme Court, and he was ordered to be retried, at which point he pled guilty to avoid the death penalty and was given a life sentence.
Chapter 6: The Ghosts of Corpsewood. It's been reported that the LSD went missing after the trial, and that there was a lot of folks high in that little town. Vandals burned the Satanic Castle and the chicken house down. The place now in utter ruin, looted, defaced, the brick walls smashed and beginning to crumble. And the Beware of Things sign, it eventually ended up on eBay, fetching a pretty penny.
Oddly enough, things began to reappear. The rose bushes were put back. So many bricks returned, they were piling up. It appears that whoever took souvenirs felt haunted and cursed, and were compelled to take back what they'd taken.
And of course, the place is said to be haunted as hell. The sound of the doctor's golden harp can be heard, the haunting growling of ghost dogs, and moans of orgiastic pleasure echoing into the night. And the entire area has been deemed Devil Worshipper Mountain.
Which would have pissed off Charles to no end. He was an atheist. He didn't worship devils. In fact, devil worshiper is an insult the Church of Satan uses. It's what they called Richard Ramirez.
The sigil of Baphomet's stained glass window Charles had so painstakingly crafted by hand had been purchased by a firearms dealer in Tennessee. And when he got busted by the ATF for an international arms dealing ring, his girlfriend became convinced they were cursed by the window and shot it with a machine gun, which is really sad. It is truly a beautiful work of art. We'll put some photos of it up on social media.
The gazebo structure still stands, though it's spray painted and battered, grown over with vines and bushes, and the steel doors still lie there on the forest floor from when they were ripped off their hinges. Morbid tourists, spooky freaks, and bored teenagers still go out there.
Honestly, I'd go out there if I was ever near there, but I'd be very respectful though, and I would not take anything.
Same. And then things got really weird. The bodies of Dr. Charles Scudder and Joey Odom were brought to the coroner's office in the back of a pickup truck, then brought to the tri-state crematory to be cremated. If you're a true crime aficionado, you may have heard of the place.
I have. Though their ashes were brought to Corpsewood and spread about the property, they say their ghosts lingered there at the crematorium, a poltergeist causing all kinds of mischief. And in 2002, this crematorium made international news when more than 300 corpses were found laying around the grounds. Some found mummified in abandoned cars, some lying out in the open, some crammed into vaults packed to the brim, decomposing altogether into a, quote, malodorous biological soup of liquefied human corpses.
If we ever do a spin-off podcast, it should be called Malodorous Biological Soup of Liquefied Human Corpses.
Yes, absolutely.
But in all seriousness, that is absolutely horrifying. Family members and loved ones of the deceased were rightly just beyond horrified, disgusted. The entire town was scandalized yet again. I tell you, this place is weird. But why? Why would this have happened?
No one knows. Some think that the vapors from the mercury fillings in the corpse's teeth could have affected the owner, Tommy Marsh, who'd grown up on the grounds and inherited the operation from his father. When he cremated the bodies, the mercury vapors caused him to go mad. And he just stopped cremating the bodies, started leaving them in vehicles on the 16-acre property, storing them in barns and vaults. There were 334 bodies in total. And when loved ones received what they thought were cremated remains, he was really just giving them ground up concrete.
Oh, that's so just awful on so many levels.
There's not why. The crematorium was working. It's
crazy.
Why don't do it?
Right. Reports had been made to the sheriff's office that there were body parts lying around the crematorium property for years, but they didn't take them seriously. A lot of instances of cops not taking things seriously in this story. Until Valentine's Day 2002, when a neighbor's dog brought a human femur bone to its owner. When the crematorium was eventually searched, bodies dating all the way back to 1996 were found.
Could it have been the ghosts that had made him stop cremating the bodies?
Do we know how many miles that crematorium was from Corpsewood Manor?
No, I don't think it's that many miles though, because it's in that little town there.
Yeah, I'm just curious, just how close it was.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And that is the tragic and haunting story of Corpsewood Manor and the town of Treon, Georgia.
It's a crazy one for sure. Ugh.
It speaks on so many levels about, I don't know, society and culture and people and human nature and the human conditions. I really love that story. I mean, it's tragic and sad, but it's an intense story.
Yeah, and if you look up the photos of Dr. Scudder and Joey and their two dogs, I mean, it's terrible. They did not deserve to die. His words are so interesting. What was it again? I
asked for it.
I asked for this. Yeah, I mean, my take on that is that he did feel like he got them hooked up with these people for no reason and it ended in tragedy. Like he shouldn't have ever, I don't know, it was just like a weird turn of events that even brought them together.
Yeah, I feel the
Not
same
even like a
way.
weird turn of events, just like if anything, it's like not all that special or crazy happenstance. It's just like a really bad coincidence, like wrong place, wrong time to have like met the Brock, it's just
Why did
bad
they move
chain
to
of
Georgia? I don't. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Why
that
not go
too.
to
They
like,
could have been much more accepted and left alone elsewhere.
yeah, like the Pacific Northwest, or so many places you could go that would be, or even like I don't know, Athens, Georgia is like a much more accepting town. You know, that's like where REM and all those bands are from. I don't know. He was, you know, in many ways, he was killed because of his own kindness.
Yeah, which totally sucks. I don't know. And then the stuff about the cemetery. I mean, the crematorium is bizarre too. Like, there's got to be something in the water there.
Yeah, and that artist, that crazy like art, he painted Elvis everywhere, and like REM asked them to do their album cover
Yeah.
and Talking Heads. It's just like a weird. There's only 1,600 people in the town, and like there's all these like brutal murders and crazies, and it's just a nuts.
Crazy.
And that's
Well,
gonna do it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for listening, and you know we want to hear from you. Did we get something wrong? You got a case we should cover? Just want to say hi. Shoot us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you next week with a special 50th episode celebration.